Well, hello everybody once again and welcome to the All Saints podcast. I'm delighted to bring to you today a very special guest, a friend of mine. He's an elder at Trinity Reformed Church in Huntsville, Alabama. It's a CREC church. I'm here today with Larson Hicks. Larson, thank you very much indeed for joining us on the podcast.
Great to be here, Pastor Jeffrey. Thanks for having me.
Well, listen, you and I were talking a week or so ago, and you shared in that context a whole bunch of things which I'd like to get to talking about today, because I think they have the potential to be very helpful for us here at All Saints and perhaps elsewhere as we're trying to understand ourselves and understand the intellectual and Christian culture we're living in. But perhaps just as a way into that, could you tell us something about the history of your church in the last couple of years and particularly the growth you've seen? And then we'll jump from that to some of the effects that that's brought about.
Yeah. Well, it's a pleasure and honor to be here. And I also hope that this will be profitable for the saints there and here and anywhere else that listen to this conversation. And as we kind of think through these ideas and problems and questions. So just background, our church, we started the effort of planting in 2019 and kind of struggled to get traction. We're sort of feeling around for different ways to approach church planting. And then COVID happened, and we kind of had all of our ducks in a row. We had our steering committee, and we had several men who were gifted preachers who were willing to preach. And so COVID happened, and one of the ladies in our neighborhood that was on our church plant email list that we had been communicating for 6 months or so asked my wife if we would be willing to host a worship service at our house in the backyard just on Sunday. And her complaint was she was just tired of video church. You know, her church had been shut down for a month at that point or more. And so had ours. And so we were like, oh, actually, yeah, that's perfect. Yes, let's do that. And so I kind of called the church planting steering committee and said, hey guys, we're getting the band back together. It's time, we're going to do this worship service on Sunday. This was like Thursday in, I want to say in April or so of 2020. And so that first Sunday, we invited, some of our friends invited some of their friends. And I think we had 9 families show up to that first backyard worship service back in April or so of 2020. And very quickly, the thing just got a head of steam on it, and it was clear that, okay, this is now happening, and the timing is right. And so we quickly found a building, and here we are in August or September of 2023. Our official membership has just crossed 400 members, so we're in the low 400s. I think attendance on Sundays is probably closer to 450 or more. So it's steadily growing. New members new families are joining. It seems like every week or every other week. So that's kind of the history, really briefly, of how this church came about and how we got to where we're at today.
Wow. So it looks to me from those numbers, I mean, I'm somewhat familiar, as I'm sure you are, with some of the growth that we've seen elsewhere in the CREC, and we've been blessed here. But I haven't heard any other stories of percentage growth rates that quite match that one.
Yeah.
And so that's what I mean. And the first thing to say, I guess, is, well, praise God for that. And
yes,
you guys absolutely must be running to keep still,
It's crazy.
As we were talking, though, last week, you highlighted a couple of features of the demographic and the rapid growth and the information landscape that people have been taking on board, which have created at least the possibility of, and in some cases the reality of, some real problems.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you could just give us a 36,000 foot view of that, and then we'll jump into some of the details.
Yeah, as best I can. I think what I said to you in the call the other day was, you hear this in church planting circles. You got to be careful. Whatever it is you do to bring people in is what you have to keep doing to keep them. And I think inadvertently, I don't think that our identity as a church, was formed long prior to COVID. So we met as a steering committee, developed our constitution and our distinctives long before COVID. But as it providentially worked out, we really started in earnest right at the start of COVID, and in some ways, our meeting itself was sort of a political protest, And
Hmm.
again, this wasn't like our scheme or our plan or anything. It just is. What happened at the time was nobody was meeting, and we were, and people who were interested in meeting saw a church with a backbone and thought, hey, this is the place I want to be. They're willing to do, get down and dirty and fight the cultural wars. And then I put on a conference in January, about 6 months after we planted, on the theme of the conference was biblical masculinity. We had Vodi Bakum. We had George Grant and Rich Lusk and Ben Merkel and Michael Foster. And so we were, again, it was still very much in the middle of COVID. So there was everyone was still wearing masks and very few places were open. We had to do the conference outside of town. And again, I really, to be totally honest, was not, for me, this wasn't, hey, let me stick my thumb up or nose up at the government here and try to make some statement. It was really,
Right.
These are the issues I thought we needed to talk about. And I wasn't worried about COVID the way that everyone else seemed to be. And then, the last thing I'll mention is we did a lot of dances early on as a church where English country dances.
Well, you know what the Puritans said about that, right?
No.
You're just asking for trouble.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Sorry.
Well,
but I digress. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's right. It was again another sort of statement, I think, that we were making. And again, I got to reiterate that it was sort of inadvertent. I mean, I knew that this was countercultural, especially in the midst of this pandemic craziness, but it wasn't, hey, how can we fight the pandemic craziness? Let's do this, that, or the other. It was kind of incidental. But I think what's happened is we've attracted to ourselves through some of that people who are really interested in fighting the culture wars and who are really interested in I've talked about it as kind of a red pill addiction. It's like I want to know what the red pill is. I want to know what the hardcore position is that nobody's willing to talk about. And I think they saw us as people that would sort of scratch that itch. And so we've ended up with a lot of people now who are very interested in alternative history, alternative perspectives on just about anything and everything. And sort of, in my estimation, a lot who are almost have this insatiable need for the next big, cultural thing that is kind of the problem with everything that we need to wake up to. It's a lot of, I think that the term red pill addiction is kind of my new way of articulating what I think it is.
Right. Well, let's just jump into that because you've said a lot there. And so just to give some glossary.
Yeah.
If you're listening to this or watching this and you've never watched The Matrix, you need to go and watch that movie, right? Because that's where the term red pill originates. And so if I recall, it's that famous scene where the Matrix is this imaginary world that Neo is trapped in, and Morpheus, who's the leader of the rebels, gets him in this room and gives him a red pill and a blue pill, and he says, if you take the blue pill, everything goes back to normal, you go back to sleep and you can live in your dream world. Take the red pill and I'll show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. And the point is then the red pill, to take the red pill is to deliberately try to discover the truth, whatever the cost and however outlandish it might appear. And what's happened is that term has become the way of describing, especially in online contexts, thinking of 4chan, Reddit, other kind of ideological heavy online contexts. But it's become the label for, okay, what's the conspiratorial explanation that's the sort of universal acid that eats through everything? And so what you're suggesting then is that, you start this church and by God's grace, it picks up, but the providential circumstances in which it takes off give the false impression that you guys are just dispensers of one red pill a week, right?
Yeah, that's
So
right.
this week COVID, next week essential oils as a cure for cancer. The week after that, it will be the Illuminati. Come
Yeah.
back, and you know what I'm saying. You get
Oh
more
yeah.
every. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Well, and the other, to make matters worse, we are Catholic in the small c sense of the word. So we've made things even worse by saying, and again, this is not intentional, but one of our distinctives is we're not going to divide over what we consider to be secondary theological issues. And so the biggest, most obvious one in our context today and in the Bible Belt is baptism, where we've said you don't have to be Paedo-Baptist to be a member of this church. We will happily baptize your children. We'll defer to the family on this, so long as obviously those convictions are something that they think is important. But so that's what that's done is we've opened the doors pretty wide to people from very different backgrounds. And what's happened, I think, there is this phenomena of moving fast theologically. So people go, these were the guys who were willing to stand up during COVID, right? I want to learn more from them. And then they hear Trinity Reformed. I literally have had families show up and say, we love this church. We love the singing. We love the teaching. We love the families. What does Reformed mean? I've never heard that term. Right?
Wow.
I mean, that's
wonderful.
It's wonderful. It's kind of what we were praying for.
Yeah.
And so we're delighted because we're meeting the needs of the people in our community, and we're not leading with, hey, you must be Reformed first to be able to be here. But what that's led to, I think, going back to the red pill thing, Reformed theology becomes a red pill, right? It's like, oh, it's this new, I'm going down the rabbit hole of this new perspective that explains all of Scripture and theology in a way, and the veil's coming off and I'm seeing everything. And I think our temptation in those circumstances, because we go, well, certainly somebody who's interested in Reformed theology, that's a good thing. Let's just lean right into that and let's accommodate them moving fast theologically. But what I'm nervous is happening is that we're feeding this red pill addiction, and they go, okay, I figured out Reformed theology. Tell me about postmillennialism. Now tell me about covenant renewal worship. Now tell me about about the next thing, the next big theological shift. And before you know it, they're going, okay, now what's next? I want to move on to the next big thing. And we're going, well, that's it. I think those are the big ones.
Right. Now, this struck me in the few days after we were talking last week, and I was trying to superimpose an ideological or theological framework on the sociological phenomena that you described. And it suddenly struck me. I was actually talking to another gentleman and then a couple of other ladies who just dropped in the church office. They swung by. They were helping with the church library here. And it just hit me that what's happening in our information landscape is that there are a whole cluster of different contexts of broadly conservative or Christian or both ideological resistance. It's long-standing institutions like think tanks and publishing houses. It's some newer think tanks like Reason.com and the Manhattan and the guys who published the City Journal. Is that Manhattan Institute? I forget. Claremont Institute. But then there's newer entities. There are online groups. There are smaller and newer theological movements. There's networks that are more deliberately secretive. Private members groups and clubs and so on. And then there are commercial entities where they're seeing what looks to them like the left wing woke takeover of corporate America and trying to think, okay, how can we establish a conservative foothold in the corporate context? And then off the back of these are a whole bunch more fringy groups. Now, what happens if you plot each of these entities in a multi-dimensional landscape of ideological conviction, right? So you plot them, how Christian are they? And there's a spectrum there, and how conservative and how reformed. And then what's their stance on big government? what did they think about COVID? What do they think about vaccines? What do they think about head coverings? What do they think
Yep.
about the crazy things that we keep hearing about, how the Jewish people are the cause of every problem that we see in modern society? And what happens is that these organizations, entities, these loci are all spread out on all these spectra. So some are really quite extreme at some ends of the spectrum, in terms of the Jewish people are at fault for everything and armed resistance should be on the next item on the agenda. Whereas others are really quite innocuous, 100-year-old conservative think tanks. But here's the key thing. All of these are interconnected, and they're interconnected relationally and socially. So that some guy who's thoughtful, Christian, conservative instincts gets hooked into one of these organizations, and one of them might be your CREC church. And they're discovering all this stuff which is new and exciting and invigorating, and it's liberating because there's true stuff in there. But that is connected to a bunch of other things. It's your church here and a Facebook group there, which is another Facebook group over there, which is then a Reddit, a subreddit. And then and what happens is that because people make decisions and form convictions sociologically and not simply cognitively, people get sucked down this rabbit hole of increasingly wild, lurid, fanciful, false, and destructive ideologies, and there's no brakes on it. So somebody who comes for the paedobaptism, the covenant renewal worship, 6 weeks later is blaming, quote unquote, the Jews for everything. And 6 weeks after that, you discover they've joined some secret society which is plotting to unseat every leftist from an S&P 500 company board. So, I mean, do you think that's a reasonable depiction of the sociological landscape?
I think so. I think it's an excellent depiction of the sociological landscape. I think it's worse though. You said that there are no breaks. I think it's worse than not having breaks. I think you have a lot of folks who have tapped into this network and realized there's a lot of money to be made. There's a lot of attention to be garnered by tapping into these networks. And so we're going to, and it's kind of providential, let's say, that my son just brought me coffee, and he brought it to me in this mug. Is my Fight Laugh Feast mug that I
got my Athanasius Press glass right here.
Oh, good.
We've all got the bling, right?
This is a good example. Fight Laugh Feast, who I'm good friends with several of all of those guys. Think they're great. But they're also trying to run a business. They're also trying to build a membership. And we all know this. This is kind of, some of this is the dark patterns of the web. The algorithms have figured this out. But people like Rush Limbaugh articulated this 20, 30 years ago, that controversy, paranoia, fear is really what sells. It's what keeps people's attention. It's what draws the eyeballs. And so there are groups who are trying to build influence for various reasons, whether it's financial or cultural or even, with a ministry aim, to get your eyeballs. They are going to stoke fears about different things. And so, I think what's happened for us is, you get these, let's say, Baptists who come into our church and say, this is great. I didn't know any of this stuff existed before. What else can I read? Where else can I go? And podcasts are probably the most accessible. It's why we're doing this right now. It's a very accessible means of teaching and learning. You can do it while you're washing the dishes and on your commute. And so people go, what other podcast should I be listening to? And so they jump on Fight Laugh Feast. Looks really interesting. You see really controversial topics there, and you want to dive into them. And before you know it, what you just described really happens, and you find yourself in the strange bedfellow situation where you're starting to go down the rabbit hole deeper and deeper on all these issues, and find yourself way off in some weird corners of the internet, hanging out with some people that I would say are not at all friendly to our worldview.
And there's that tacit endorsement phenomenon, isn't it? Because it's like, well, I know Larson Hicks. He's a solid guy. He's Reformed Christian, godly man, great family. He goes to this church, and that other guy who's a member of this 4chan group, also goes to that church.
Yeah.
And so you're 2 steps away in this network
Totally.
of ideological loci from some really crazy stuff.
Yeah.
And it's not just,
Well,
like you said, it's not just there are no brakes, it's that somebody's glued the accelerator down.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and it's, I don't know how many of these you mentioned it, but I don't know how many of these small, private, member only men's groups there are out there, but I know of at least 6 or 7 that just men in my church have mentioned they're a part of, right? And they're like small private groups of men who, it comes, a lot of this, I'm sure this is a direction we might want to go in the conversation, but a lot of it really comes from a loss of kind of ecclesiocentrism, this where the church kind of is just one of these sociological nodes that you're connected to, but it's not the main one. There's no hierarchy here, and so it's kind of on a level playing field with Fight Laugh Feast, or with the podcast you listen to, or with the men's group that you're a part of, and so they're all competing. To tell you, it seems they're all competing ideologically for defining what the real priorities are. And if your church is interested in promoting that you live a quiet and peaceful life, if your church is not stoking your paranoia and stimulating your attention, then you're just, in terms of time and headspace, you're just going to give these other outlets more of your time and energy, and before you know it, they're really going to be your primary, where you're deriving your primary identity and direction from.
Yeah. Well, look, I think we need to come back to the ecclesiocentrism, the church-centered point, because we'll need to defend the validity of an ecclesiocentric stance towards knowledge and life and community, because otherwise we're in danger of being accused of just self-servingly bigging up our own locus within this landscape. But I want to just pick up a couple of thoughts you made. The fear point and paranoia is just so obvious now after how many years of social media, 15 pushing 20. And it's just behavioral economics. Right? Anybody who's read Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, he's got that phrase, losses loom larger than gains. And the point he's making there is most of the experimental work has been done on people's attitude to financial losses and financial gains in hypothetical situations or in real life investing scenarios. But what it means when it's translated into ideology and life, it's not losses in financial terms, it's fear. So bad news stories run hotter than good news stories. Kid did well at college. You could have 1,000 kids who do well at college, nobody cares. But one kid who goes away to college from some small town and trashes the place and gets thrown out, that'll make news. And it's or the negative emotion it's a vulnerability in our psychological makeup. We're not well attuned to appropriately downplaying or turning the gain down on fear-stoking stories. And then you couple that to your follow the money point. And then you start to realize really what's going on. And this is no disrespect intended to every Christian parachurch ministry or Facebook group or broadcaster. Like you, I'm friends with the guys at Cross Politic and so on. And in fact, it is specifically that no general criticism is intended, because what those good organizations are doing is good. Of course, they need money to keep going and produce their content, but it's precisely because of the legitimation of that model by good and sound organizations that flaky and destructive ones can leverage the same approach to revenue generation. And therefore, they need the same behavioral and epistemic landscape to operate on, which they do spectacularly well, right?
They do. They do.
And so just to think about, before we just jump to the ecclesiology point, because we do need to come back and defend that, I've got a couple of other questions I wanted to talk through. And the first is the obvious observation, right? That not only are your congregants at Trinity Reformed Church, it's not just that they're not asking you
Yeah.
only about where to
Yeah.
get this content from. They're not just going to come to Elder Larson to say, hey, what should I listen to next? There are
Yep.
399 other people in that church. They'll ask them.
Yep.
But there is just a vast ocean of content.
Yeah.
And there's no way of, I mean, if I podcasted live full time every day, there's no way I could even touch the tsunami of content that people at All Saints
Right.
could, if they wanted to,
Right.
avail themselves of.
Right.
And that creates a very real problem for thinking about how we address this, right? Because what you can't just do is say, well, if you can't beat them, join them. You know, because there's this, we can't out podcast
No.
thousands or tens or hundreds of thousands of people who are incentivized financially into producing this content. So what are your thoughts about that? Does that generate a sense of despair in the pit of your stomach, or do you have other thoughts about how to deal with this situation?
I mean, I think I'd be lying if I said it doesn't bother me and it doesn't create some anxiety from time to time. And it's something that the elders at our church and I have been discussing and thinking a lot about. And it's absolutely right that we can't expect to match swords with this, the legion of podcasters and conspiracy theorists who are vying for our people's attention. So we really can't try to fight fire with fire in that analogy. I think that we've got to point people back to scripture and point people back to what we've been commanded to do. We've been commanded not to worry about tomorrow. That's a command that's given. Not to fear is a command that's given over and over throughout scripture. And we're commanded to work 6 days. Boredom is a huge part of this problem. We live in this age where our work is really, really easy, and we don't have most people are very busy, supposedly, but not very productive, I would say. And that's I'm painting with a broad brush, and I know everybody is going to hear this and say, well, that applies to other people, but not me. But truthfully, I think we're all quite I think we have a lot more free time on our hands than we like to give ourselves credit for, even during our work days. And so a lot of time is spent on social media, and social media, in and of itself is designed, scientifically engineered to keep our attention and hold it and drive us to continue to engage with it. And so we're fools to think that that's not happening.
Yes.
So I think that, I think that there's no way, you're right, that we're going to be able to keep up with all of it. What we really need to do is develop in our people what I'm describing as an intellectual immune system or a spiritual immune system. And one of those is recognizing that one of those things is your shepherds. When Christ saw the multitude, he was moved to compassion because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And what we need to remind our people is that you are not sheep without a shepherd. The Lord has left you with shepherds whose duty that they will be held accountable for is to care for your soul. And so as you get more and more overstimulated by all of the paranoia that's coming at you, look to your shepherds for, like, I'm nervous, I'm paranoid, I'm anxious about all of this stuff. I'm fearful. It's absorbing a lot of my headspace. I'm struggling with gratitude. I'm struggling with focus at work. All I can think about is how the world is falling apart. Shepherds, what do I do? Appeal to your shepherds, who God has given you as sort of, to stay with this immune system analogy, that they are kind of the white blood cells of the church. The shepherds are here to identify those false prophets, those wolves in sheep's clothing, and to call them out. And so when people come to me, and you're right, and this is just to add to the despair, one of the things that is that is
before we remember the resurrection. Yeah.
that's right. It is that one of the unhelpful and I think false responses of people who are immersed in this stuff is to think that your elders or your pastors, their lack of concern about these things is indicative of the fact that they are just out to lunch. That we're just boomers. Boomers who just haven't taken the red pills yet and don't understand, right? And not thinking that perhaps our elders have wisdom and are seeking to guide and shape the priorities of the people in our church according to Scripture and according to wisdom. And they're not promoting all of these propaganda and conspiracy theories because they actually don't think that they're valid or something that we should be spending energy on.
Because your illustration there of an intellectual or spiritual immune system, I think, is profoundly helpful. I remember you mentioned this before, and alongside it, the analogy of an autoimmune disorder. And so, if we just take those like one at a time, so the Reformed Catholicity that we want to promote, where of course we welcome into our churches people with actually quite a wide range of theological views, provided that they're willing to be in churches where we teach this Reformed Protestant spirituality and way of life and eschatology and sacramentology and everything else. We welcome them all in. But you cannot do that if people lack an intellectual and spiritual immune system. People have to learn to discernment, in effect, isn't it? It's the capacity to just be able to tell, all right, I'm sorry, that's just crazy. And it's not the sort of thing that can be coached easily or done solo. And that perhaps connects with your ecclesiology point. Again, we'll have to come to that later on. But the autoimmune issue is fascinating as well, because that is, there's something about the obsession with whatever the next red pill is, the red pill addiction, which is unrefutable for that reason. So somebody who says, whoa, hold on a second. Maybe it's not all about fluoride in the water. Like maybe there are some issues with rising rates of allergies and autism among children.
Blue light.
But maybe it's not all fluoride in the water. And the fact that you're pushing back against that is taken as indicative that you're part of the problem. So people are in effect cutting themselves off from the divinely ordained, just to anticipate the defense of ecclesiology, the divinely ordained structures that are there to help them. It's like your body attacking itself, and it's going to destroy itself. That's why autoimmune disorders are so destructive.
No, absolutely. It's we're warned. I mean, we're told in Scripture about immature faith looks like being thrown about by every wind and wave of doctrine, and I think if people don't recognize that this is something I'm susceptible to as a young Christian, or as a or a new convert, let's say, to a different tradition, I'm probably more susceptible to being tossed about than the average, than a mature Christian in the faith. And so, I gave an exhortation at our church a couple months ago to the women that getting on, the ladies' Slack channel and asking, just posting, what's the most reformed brand of diapers to buy for or wipes to buy for my, kids, or my kids are cranky, and is it because they have food dyes in their in the food we're feeding them, or whatever the thing is.
Yes.
That Scripture commands younger women to go to the older women and to learn from them. And I think it's easy for us. I think it's easy for us to tell ourselves we are obeying that commandment by getting on social media and talking with other women. And in fact, I would say it's really not at all that. You're doing something that's, I think, perhaps the opposite. you're amassing for yourself a teachers that you're interested in listening to. It's this echo chamber of other people who want to just reinforce your paranoia or your concern. I've been concerned about, Bluetooth and wireless radiation causing sleep troubles in my house. Who else sees that? And you're never going to have, usually the wise women, I'm just to stick with the women example, the wise godly women are not even going to engage with that conversation. They're not even probably going to be on the list. They're going to be busy with the work that they've been called to do.
Right.
And so, yeah, I think there's a need for us to recognize this is a temptation. This is a struggle. This is a problem. We're commanded, younger Christians are commanded to go seek the wisdom and advice and to imitate those who are older and have wisdom. And so I think that's one of the places to start when it comes to just starting to deal with this stuff.
Yeah. Your allusion to Paul's writings to Timothy, the itching ears point, is fascinating because in the first century, what you had to do if you were minded to do that was to gather around yourself people to tell you what your itching ears wanted to hear. Now the algorithms do it for you. And I'm still convinced that we haven't got sufficiently well-formed intuitions to discern how much that's happening, the degree to which you are being fed stuff, which an algorithm that is 10 gazillion times faster than you at spotting what you're going to be interested in next. It's feeding you things. I had an example just the other day. I got a text message from a guy that was describing him chopping a tree down. I go on YouTube because I'm looking for something else, and I get a video of a guy chopping a tree down. I mean, it's like, what in the world has just happened?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. I've never watched videos of guys chopping down wood, right? I mean, this is just not a thing I do. And
see, the temptation is to hear that story and to go down this rabbit trail of a paranoid scheme about how the government's trying to rewire our brains and trying to invade our privacy and mess with us. And the answer to all of this is just stop being passive. Stop turning your brain off and plopping yourself in front of a screen and doom scrolling feed and calling that research. That's not research. You're being fed something by an algorithm, and it has no. I want to, in the least paranoid way, say I don't know that the algorithm has any higher aim than your time and engagement. I mean,
that's exactly
if it can get you to. If it just wants you to click on it, spend time on it, and get make comments, like it, share it, that's the extent of it. I don't see and I'm sure there are examples of nefarious use of these things to promote a candidate or a political thing. I'm sure that's happening. I'm sure people can do that. But the bigger concern for me is just the number of people who have said, I've been doing a lot of research on X, and then start to tell you about their concern about something. When you probe that a little further and go, tell me about your research. What I've never found is somebody who's doing an intellectually honest and rigorous attempt at discovering the truth. What I find mostly is doom scrolling, conspiracy theory threads and clicking on every article or podcast or conspiracy video that's posted there. And so really what you're doing is willfully allowing yourself to be propagandized by whatever the cause is.
Right.
It's anything but research.
Yes.
Just because you've absorbed lots of information does not mean that you've done research or have become. And the point in the podcast I recorded with Jeffery a week or so ago, he made the point that he can sit around and talk with libertarian zealots and find that they can't describe they have no real substantive understanding of world history to speak of. They know everything about their one little narrow
Mm-hmm.
fascination. But when it comes to just, okay, what time and place did any of this stuff even happen in? And
Right.
what was the
No
other,
idea.
what were the other things that were happening in that time? There's zero literacy. And so it's one of the things that I'm also want to call out is the value of a real education.
Mm-hmm. Abroad
Real
and
education
thorough. Yeah.
leaves you more humble than you came in. A
Yes.
real education does that, and I think that I don't think we have very many people in the world today. Not my church, your church, wherever you want to point. I think we have very few people that are actually have what I would call a good education.
Yes. Well, and a good education is necessarily broad enough to instill that sense of humility. I'm struck by the resonance between what you're saying there and the phenomenon that doctors, in particular, have noticed in the last 25 years. And you'll know a bit about that because of your professional vocation. But when a patient who has read everything they can find about a particular narrow field, and they just, of course, they have more quotations and citations at their fingertips than their 30-year experienced general practitioner that they go in to see. They can go in and they talk to the guy who's actually the expert because he understands the field broadly and all the other things that need to be understood to make a valid assessment of the situation. But he goes in, the patient goes in and comes to the conclusion wrongly that, goodness, not even the experts know this stuff that I've found on the internet.
Right.
And what's actually happened, you pointed out that it's not scientific. It is precisely non-scientific in the Popperian sense. You think of Karl Popper's philosophy of science, which is still the gold standard for how you're supposed to do scientific investigation. Science is not, no matter what anybody ever tells you, it is not about trying to prove something. It is about the enterprise of trying to disprove something. And so somebody who says, well, I'm trying to understand, do essential oils help with such and such a condition? And they Google, do essential oils help with such and such a condition? Well, guess what? What they're not doing is searching for all the research, which probably hasn't been done, because why would you need to prove that essential oils can't help you with migraines? Because there's no mechanism at all that could substantiate that link. That the only stuff out there is the spurious claims put about by people who are doing this non-scientifically.
Yeah. Well, and it's even worse than that in that particular example with doctors, because I think doctors are guilty of the same problem. Physicians, the world of healthcare has become more and more and more specialized, like everything else. And so you have the same problem of a lack of a broad education. I think physicians today take one semester of statistics, and their ability to discern, is this study even something that is worth paying attention to?
Right.
As pharma reps are just shoving their studies in front of them all day, every day, to try to make their point, to promote their drugs. So anyway, the point is that there's far too little skepticism and education from physicians as well. And so this is part of the crisis. I mean, to back up, this is why I think this has reached kind of crisis level in my mind, is that there are so few authorities that we can trust anymore, anywhere.
Right.
Whether it's medical or government or educational or academic, there's just nobody anymore, it seems, that we can trust. And so people have cut themselves off and have almost said, if you're, I don't trust anybody that's higher up the authority, any sort of hierarchy from me. I want to go figure it out myself, and I'm going to do my own research. And so that's where we're at today. And that's why I think this problem is become so pernicious, is that people don't trust the government, they don't trust any authorities, and are even more drawn to this kind of exploration.
So what you're highlighting there is a question I was going to ask way back, and you've returned to it. One of the challenges in addressing this whole red pill addiction is that some of the red pills turn out to be right. Like, it actually turns out to be true that senior health officials with too much medical training to justify the mistakes that they made did seek to mislead the American, and in fact the world population.
Sure.
And
Sure.
That genuine recognition of actual problems can create this generalization across all domains, which then opens the door to the do your own research phenomenon, which is guaranteed to end up with some mistakes eventually, and probably quite dramatic ones.
Right.
I'm conscious we've got to get to this defense of a putative remedy. And one of the things, just to lead into this, I want to say what we don't want to do, you and I, Larson Hicks and Steve Jeffery, we don't want to start sounding as though here we are catastrophizing about another calamity, right? And the reason we don't want to do that is I think your ecclesiocentrism point is a defensible and workable, not so much solution, but context for a solution to this problem. So let me just, I'll try and articulate a broad framework, and then you nuance it and we'll try and defend it. Suppose we say that we're left in this fractured information landscape where on the one hand we know that many experts have proven themselves incompetent or untrustworthy, whereas on the other hand, that's not true of every expert, and it's certainly true that we're not in a position by doing our own research to sort out the problems. In addition to which, there are ideological claims from medical and dietary fads through to anti-Semitism and kinism and racism that are scattered around this landscape. And because of the matrix of ideological nodes problem, once you're on that rabbit trail, it's not that there are no brakes, it's that somebody's jammed the accelerator now. So you've got, how do you solve for this? You're a young person, 25, 30 years old, maybe you're single, maybe you're married, you've come to Trinity Reformed Church, you're at All Saints. What do you do? And what I'd want to suggest is you don't do anything crazy. And what you do is to have these conversations within the church involving, and the phrase you used, of course, a biblical phrase, involving your shepherds. Now, clearly, from a biblical standpoint, that's defensible. But at the same time, it can sound self-serving. Here are two shepherds. And here we are, we're sitting on this podcast saying, you guys can't trust the experts, but you can't find out the answers yourself. You should just trust us. Trust whatever we say to you. So let's try and unpack, and in the process, nuance and defend what we're saying. Because what we're not saying is, you just got to trust us. Trust Larson. Trust Pastor Jeffery, right? That's not what we're saying. So let's try and unpack this claim, see why it's so substantive biblically, and then defend it.
Well, I'm certainly not trying to argue that you just need to trust the church and turn your brains off. And actually, one of the things that I've encouraged our people to do a lot more of is to that it is a good and right and healthy and biblical Christian response to encounter one of these many questions that we've touched on with the response, I don't know and I don't care. Like that. So for me, it's more about having a appropriately you modulated sense of proportion, and a lot of that is grounding yourself historically, and recognizing that in the grand scheme of the controversies and struggles that the church and society in general have experienced, whatever the thing, radiation from cell phones is very minor, and these things are all so minor. And So anyway, I'm going down a rabbit trail. I
Yeah, that's
apologize.
helpful.
So
No,
you're,
it's fine.
but as far as trying to defend it, I mean, I guess for me, it's certainly not that I, as an elder, as a shepherd at my church, have lots of extra time and energy that I'm hoping to spend on researching anti-Semitism or researching, fluoride in tap water or whatever. I'm not purporting to be an expert on any of those things. What I'm purporting to be is ordained by God to care for the souls of the people in my church.
Right.
That's what I'm purporting, and I'm that my trust there is not in myself or my own research. It's in God and His Spirit to preserve and protect His church.
Right.
And so, I want to encourage people to have faith in God and to live out that faith by trusting the shepherds that God has ordained and established in your life.
Right.
And so it won't necessarily, in my case, look like you getting answers to all of your questions
Right.
about all of these things. You may get an assignment from me, instead of an answer. You may get an assignment to help serve the church in a particular way,
Or get a job,
or to get a job.
Like, work 6 days, and then we'll have a conversation.
Right. So yeah, what are you doing in your life to take dominion and to provide more for your family?
So I want to just. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say I want to just flesh that out, because it's if we try to line up a bunch of bullet points in defense of an ecclesiocentric stance towards this stuff, the first would have to be that the church is that organism on earth through which God has committed to work, and which God has committed to preserve, and to which He has committed your welfare as a sheep, as a believer, and in which He has placed people whom He is holding responsible for you. And none of those things are true about your favorite Facebook group. Sorry.
That's right.
Right? So
right.
Now what that means is it is not all about the pastor. Okay? It's not all about me, it's not all about you, but it is about this entity, this community is the community that God has promised to keep and preserve, and within which we are to be nurtured. Now, related to that, of course, you think, well, what does Scripture say about that? And there are inbuilt criteria for discerning where is a good church to be. And of course, not every church is going to be so helpful on these matters or anything else.
Sure.
And who are good people in the church to listen to and pastors to have in your church. And the simple fact is, it's an embodied community where people live in relationship, and your pastor, the people in your church. I don't think I could hide for very long if my marriage were falling apart, or if I were only working a 15-hour week, or any number of other things which would disqualify me as a guide to the people of God. And the reason is almost a distinct point. This is an embodied community. And there's something, we are embodied creatures. When we shouldn't be trying to think our way through life. We should be trying to live our way through life. It's reflected in the point you made previously about the very real and practical connection between this ideological capture, the failure of the ideological immune system on the one hand, and somebody just having too much time on his hands. If you're working 10-hour days, 5 days a week, and all day Saturday you're with your kids, with your wife, you're fixing up the house, you're helping others fix up, do stuff they need to do, you're helping people move into town from out of town because they're joining your church at the rate of $50 a month, you don't have time to spend on this stuff. I talked to my wife.
This is very true.
Yeah, my wife is one of the most productive people I know, and she doesn't spend time on social media because she doesn't have time. And it's not, interestingly, it's not that she's always rushing around from place to place. It's just that she's always doing productive things, steadily chipping away at business projects. She's working on that. She's teaching the kids. She's working on that. She's reading something. She's working around the house. She's going to meet with people in the church, sitting down with them. She's always got something which is to do with the people around her, the life that she's got, the vocation that she has, the people in the church that she's responsible to be serving as a fellow member. And so this is a cluster of features of the church which lie behind the obvious biblical claim that, like, this is the community where our lives in Christ should be centered.
Yeah.
Now, that of course means that, well, of course we can have conversations, right? We can have, but I was interested. I was struck by a point you made, and this would be a harsh way of putting it, but don't know, don't care.
Yes.
Now, I'll give you an example of this. I didn't say don't know, don't care. What I said was, don't know, going to think about this, but I'm really glad you're handling it in this understated way. A young lady came to me to ask about head coverings.
Yeah.
Now, here's a fascinating thing, right? Because head coverings, what harm could it do? Well, in itself, I don't think it's much of an issue. Where it becomes an issue is when it becomes the thing that we have to get sorted out. And if we don't fix this, we're on the road to perdition. In other words, it's your point about a proportionate stance towards the significance of an issue. So what I said to this lady was, I've noticed, there are 10 or 12 ladies in our church who wear head coverings. I know that some of them, they've talked to their husbands, and their husbands think that's a good idea, and that's why they do it. But I've not encountered a kind of proselytizing stance towards that issue. And I praise God for that. Now, it may be that some of that going on, but a proselytizing stance is not the same as a kind of, can we have a conversation about this? And I genuinely welcome that.
Yeah.
But it's got to be kept within its proper proportions in relation to the other things that the church is concerned about. And this is the final point I want to make about the church, and then have your thoughts on this. The living God has given to the church a particular mission, a particular goal. We are to be that organism within the world in and through which Christ is present, and Christ is building his kingdom, extending his kingdom. It's Acts 29, not the organization, right? It's the mission of the book of Acts to proclaim and to live out the gospel to the ends of the earth, embodied in our lives. Now, what that does, here's the crucial functional benefit of this, is it gives us a framework for assessing the relative importance of different issues. So if somebody says to me, well, I've got three things I want to talk about. I want to talk about whether I should get married. I want to talk about if I were to get married, what are your thoughts about educating your children? Oh, and I definitely want to talk about radiation from cell phone towers. I'm like, okay, listen, I can see the church's mission very closely tied to the first two of those things.
Yeah.
The third looks to me like a bit of Minority Report pseudoscience.
Yeah.
Come back to me in 20 years' time and we'll have a beer and we may talk about that for 10 minutes. But really.
That's right.
And so the church's mission allows us to place these issues on an order of priority. While at the same time, there are some issues that the racism, kinism, anti-semitism, and so on, those are actually subject just straightforward biblical critique. Those postures are wrong. Is that the sort of thing you think is going to be helpful to you and to us as we're seeking to navigate the next few years?
I do. I think the thing that you said that I think ties all of it together is the embodied aspect of the church, and the fact that we weren't called to a set of ideologies or a set of doctrines.
We're not Gnostics.
Even, right? What'd you say?
We're not Gnostics.
We're not Gnostics. That's right. And so Christ works through people. His Spirit fills people, gives them a spirit of wisdom to navigate different things. And I've said this often to people who want to talk about parenting. One of the things I've said to my kids is that it would be deeply evil for me to treat you all the same way, because I am your father and I know you each very well. And I know how you are each different. And it would be evil for me. It would be ideologically driven evil for me to treat you all as if I didn't know the difference between you all, to apply some wooden standard to the way that I parent each of you. I'm not going to do that because I'm a father.
Right.
And I know you intimately, and I know what you son can handle and what you daughter can handle and what you other second son and third son. So in the same way, the greatest commandment, the second greatest commandment, to love your neighbor. I'm reminded of Chesterton talking about how, we weren't commanded to love humanity.
Right.
We were commanded to love your neighbor,
The actual
right?
human being in front of you. Yeah.
An actual human being that God has providentially placed right next to you,
Right.
right in front of you. He's a little slice of humanity that God wants you to minister to, wants you to love. And so this is the thing. I think it's Gnosticism. I think that's one of the big heresies that's looming underneath the surface of all of this, is this belief that there is some secret set of knowledge, the secret list of things that you have to figure out in order to unlock greater holiness or maturity or wisdom.
Yeah.
And in fact, what that leads you towards is a escape from the life that God's given you, the people that God's given you, the responsibilities that God's putting right in front of you. And so I think developing that proportion is really about get back into, and it's interesting because it's fashionable to care about what is about the local. Like, that's fashionable right now. People want to put down roots and be authentic and engage locally. But then you start talking with people in our circles, and it's a lot of paranoia about what's happening in public schools or what's happening in in Washington D.C. or in did you hear what they're doing in California? And the irony is that, like, our own church, one of our elders has started this political sort of engagement effort where it's very simple. The whole idea is we're just going to coordinate with a group of people who are going to make sure that somebody attends every city council meeting and takes notes. And we review those notes together. And over time, we start to publish articles on a website about what city council is up to. That's it. We're just watching and paying attention and just providing some accountability locally. Well, as it turns out, we have in our church droves of men who invest untold hundreds of hours a month in researching and reading about all of the craziness that's happening politically at the national level and the global level.
Right.
But we fail to get very much interest at all in doing something embodied in our local community.
It's more costly
in that same topic of politics.
Right. It's more costly. It's more costly.
It is.
And it's also, it's less of a dopamine hit.
Yeah.
So it's not the infinite scrolling, zero cognitive effort required. It's actually get up, get in the car, drive to the council meeting, sit for probably the same number of hours as you would have sat on the sofa, doom scrolling. But
that's right.
It's a different kind of personal commitment. And this I'm convinced is why sometimes families really start to suffer because of this, because it is far, far more difficult to commit yourself to loving your husband or your wife and to raising your kids faithfully, and especially to educating and disciplining your kids. It is, this is a podcast for another time, but when we started off down the road of homeschooling, we had some idea of how much work it was going to be. We had no idea. Really.
That's right.
And it's, that's almost, here's a heuristic, a rule of thumb for discerning an inauthentic red pill. If it can be digested and acted upon without significant effort.
Yeah, that's right.
Right.
That's right. Well, homeschool is a good example. I mean, you can take the red pill on education and determine that public school is evil. They're trying to brainwash your children, and that homeschool, and you may even take the red pill that any institution, like a school type institution, is going to emasculate your young men and cause problems. And you're not really providing proper headship for your daughters by sending them to school. You can take that red pill too and determine that homeschool is the only real way. Okay. You get the Gnostic badge of homeschool believer. But will you do the work
Right.
to educate your children the way they ought to be educated?
Mm.
Or are you just satisfied to say we're a homeschool family and then just phone it in and not really provide a rigorous education of any kind to your children? That's there's this kind of I've heard Michael Foster refer to it as listism. This kind of
box ticking.
I want to yes. And so it's like I've got my list of all my things, and these are the things that are important, and I just want to make sure I've checked them all off. But it's divorced from an embodied wisdom. I believe in the biblical idea of courtship as a approach to marriage or finding a spouse. What will that look like for each of my kids? It may look very different.
Right.
I actually, believe it or not, have encouraged a son to go on dates with multiple girls, and for some people it's like, that sound like, wait, I thought you said you were into courtship. Well, no, let's talk. Let me explain to you how I'm dealing with this particular son in a particular way and encouraging him towards wisdom and maturity.
Right. Well, there's a bunch of things here we should talk about another day, and courtship, child rearing, education. There's a bunch more. But I'm going to trespass no more on your valuable time. Elder Larson Hicks, this has been one of the most stimulating and I hope helpful for other people conversations that I've had in a long time. I'm very grateful to you. I trust and hope that the saints here at All Saints will be also. Will you come back and talk to us about something else sometime?
Oh yeah, I'd be delighted. It's been a lot of fun for me as well.
Yeah, well, it's good to connect again, and we thank God for you. Anything else you want to throw at us before we call a halt to this conversation?
No, I'll mention. I mentioned it in passing, but I did record a podcast like a week or two ago on this intellectual immune system concept with Jeffery, and I think that conversation was fruitful, and he had a lot of wisdom and good perspectives on a lot of this stuff too. So I know that's just been released, and my son up in Idaho told me that he's going to break it up into some clips and post some things on social media. So anyway,
we'll turn the comments
check that
off.
out.
And where can people find your podcast, Larson?
Just Larson Hicks Show, Trinity Reformed Church, or Trinity Reformed Kirk.com, I believe, is our website. And there's a whole page on all of our podcasts and stuff.
Great. My friend, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Yes.
Folks at All Saints and anybody else who might be watching and listening, well done for making it to the end. If you've enjoyed this, found it helpful, please like, share, and give it to anybody who also might find it useful. But with that, thank you to our guest, Larson Hicks. It's been great to have you with us, and we will see you all next time. God bless, and bye for now.